Most people think money comes from somewhere real. They imagine vaults filled with gold bars, printing presses humming with purpose, or at least some government accountant carefully tracking every dollar that enters circulation. But what if I told you the entire American monetary system runs on something far stranger than that? What if the government doesn't just print money, spend it, and hope for the best? What if there's a loop so bizarre, so circular, that it makes Alice's trip down the rabbit hole look like a straightforward journey? Here's the reality that will make your head spin. The United States government has created the most elegant financial magic trick in history. It prints money, lends that money to itself, buys its own debt with freshly created cash, and then pays interest on loans it made to itself. And somehow, this isn't considered insane. It's considered policy. This isn't some conspiracy theory cooked up in internet forums. This is the actual mechanism that keeps the American economy running. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air, the Treasury borrows it, and then the Fed buys Treasury bonds with more money it creates out of thin air. It's a loop that would make any reasonable person ask the obvious question: if you can create money to buy your own debt, why do you need to borrow money in the first place? But before we dive into this financial hall of mirrors, let me give you the context you need to understand just how wild this really is. We're not talking about some small-scale operation here. We're talking about trillions of dollars flowing through a system that most Americans have never heard explained properly. This is the engine that powers everything from your mortgage rates to grocery store prices to whether your job exists next year. The story begins with a simple problem every government faces. Running a country costs money. Armies need paychecks, roads need repairs, and politicians need projects to get re-elected. For most of human history, governments had two choices: collect taxes from citizens, or borrow money from someone who actually had it. But America discovered a third option, and it's so counterintuitive that it took decades for people to realize what was really happening. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, was sold to the American people as a way to prevent financial panics and provide stability to the banking system. What it actually became was something far more powerful and far more strange. It became the machine that allows the government to fund itself without depending on taxes or real lenders. Here's how the magic trick works in practice. Let's say the government needs $100 billion to fund its operations. The Treasury Department issues bonds, which are essentially IOUs promising to pay back the money with interest. Now, in a normal world, these bonds would be sold to investors, pension funds, or foreign governments who had real money to lend. And some of them are. But here's where it gets interesting. The Federal Reserve can simply decide to buy those bonds. And when I say buy, I don't mean they reach into some existing pile of cash. They create new money electronically with keystrokes on a computer and use that brand new money to purchase the government's debt. The Treasury gets the cash it needs and the Fed gets bonds that pay interest. But here's the beautiful part. The Fed sends most of that interest back to the Treasury as profits. So the government borrows money from itself, pays interest to itself, and gets most of that interest back. If this sounds too absurd to be real, consider what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. The Fed didn't just buy government bonds, it bought mortgage securities, corporate debt, and anything else it deemed necessary to keep the financial system from collapsing. Where did the money come from? The same place it always comes from when the Fed needs it, nowhere and everywhere. They simply created it. The numbers are staggering. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which measures how much stuff they own, went from around $800 billion before the crisis to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. That's not a typo. $9 trillion worth of bonds, mortgages, and securities purchased with money that didn't exist until they decided it should exist. And this isn't some emergency measure that got rolled back. This is now the normal way American finance operates. During the COVID pandemic, the process accelerated even further. The government needed trillions to fund relief programs, and the Fed was right there, ready to create whatever money was necessary to buy whatever debt was issued. But the loop doesn't stop there. The really mind-bending part is what happens to all this newly created money. It doesn't just sit in government accounts gathering dust. It flows into the banking system, where it becomes the foundation for even more money creation through fractional reserve lending. Banks take deposits created by Fed money printing and lend out multiples of those deposits, creating even more money in the process. This means that every dollar the Fed creates to buy government debt potentially becomes $10 or $20 circulating in the economy through bank lending. It's not just a loop. It's a loop that spawns other loops, each one creating more money that didn't exist before someone decided it should. The strangest part of all this is how normal it has become. Financial news anchors discuss Fed policy like they're talking about the weather. Politicians debate whether the Fed should buy more bonds or fewer bonds, not whether the entire system makes sense. Economics textbooks explain it with charts and graphs that make it seem scientific and inevitable. But step back for a moment and consider what we're really describing. A central bank creates money to buy debt from a government that created the central bank. The government pays interest on this debt to the central bank, which then sends most of that interest back to the government as profit. The debt sits on the Fed's books as an asset, backed by the promise of a government that could theoretically just print money to pay it off. And everyone pretends this is perfectly reasonable because, well, it's been working so far. What makes this system even more surreal is how it affects ordinary Americans who have no idea it exists. When the Fed creates money to buy government bonds, that new money doesn't magically appear in your bank account. It enters the economy through government spending and bank lending, which means it shows up as higher prices for everything you actually need to buy. Your groceries cost more not because food got scarce, but because there are more dollars chasing the same amount of food. This is the invisible tax that no politician wants to explain. When they fund programs by having the Fed buy bonds instead of raising your taxes directly, they're still taking money from you. They're just doing it by making your existing money worth less instead of taking it out of your paycheck. It's more politically palatable, but the economic effect is identical. You get poorer while the government gets the resources it wants. The banking system amplifies this effect through what economists call the money multiplier. When the Fed creates $1 billion to buy Treasury bonds, that money doesn't stay put. It becomes reserves in the banking system, and banks are only required to keep a fraction of their deposits as reserves. The rest can be lent out, creating new deposits, which become new reserves, which can be lent out again. In theory, this multiplier effect means that every dollar the Fed creates could become $10 in the broader economy. In practice, the relationship is more complex, but the principle remains. Money creation by the central bank becomes money creation by commercial banks, and the loop expands beyond anything the original architects of this system could have imagined. Here's where it gets truly bizarre. The Federal Reserve is technically a private institution owned by member banks, but it operates with government authority to create the nation's money supply. So, when the Fed buys government debt, you have a quasi-private institution creating money to lend to the government that gave it the authority to create money in the first place. It's a circle within a circle within a circle. The member banks that own the Fed receive dividends on their ownership stakes, which means they profit from the system that allows the government to fund itself without direct taxation. Meanwhile, the government benefits from being able to spend money it doesn't have without having to ask voters for permission to raise taxes. And the general public pays for all of this through the gradual erosion of their purchasing power. But the loop has an even stranger dimension. The Treasury issues bonds to fund government operations. The Fed buys some of those bonds with newly created money. The interest on those bonds gets paid by the Treasury to the Federal Reserve. The Fed then returns most of that interest to the Treasury as profit from its operations. So the government essentially pays interest to itself, collects that interest from itself, and calls it sound financial management. This circular flow of money and debt has become so routine that questioning it seems almost naive. Financial experts discuss whether the Fed should expand its balance sheet or contract it, whether it should buy more government bonds or let them mature, whether interest rates should rise or fall. But the underlying premise that a central bank should create money to buy government debt issued by the government that created the central bank rarely gets examined. The COVID pandemic revealed just how elastic this system can be. When the economy shut down and millions of people lost their jobs, the government needed trillions of dollars for relief programs. Where did that money come from? The same place it always comes from. The Fed created it and bought the bonds that funded it. In a matter of months, the central bank's balance sheet expanded by trillions, and money that had never existed before became unemployment benefits, business loans, and stimulus checks. So there you have it. The most elaborate financial magic trick ever performed, happening right in front of us every single day. The government prints money, lends it to itself, buys its own debt, and pays interest on loans it made to itself. And we call this normal. Maybe it's time to ask the obvious question. In a world where money can be created with keystrokes, what exactly are we all working so hard to earn?